Okay, so this is, now we're going to talk about how we get that energy. How do we get that ATP so we can contract? Well, some of this is review because we've already done cellular respiration this year, but we'll hit on it again just as a reminder. So creatine phosphate is like a way to recharge ATP quickly. So the creatine phosphate is going to take that ADP and add that phosphate group and add the energy to make it ATP. So this is, this pathway is used to recharge ATP before cellular respiration can really kick in. Okay, and we'll look at cellular respiration as a reminder because we've already done a lot of it this year. Okay. Remember, cellular respiration has that anaerobic phase called glycolysis. And in glycolysis, the anaerobic phase called glycolysis. And glycolysis is where we break the glucose down and make a little bit of ATP. But more importantly, we make pyruvic acid and we make NADH, that electron carrier. And then we have the aerobic phase, which is the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. And in the citric acid cycle, we do make some more ATP, but we also make a lot of NADH as an electron carrier and FADH2 as an electron carrier. Both of those go into the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is where we make all of our energy, or not all of it, most of it. We're going to make a lot of it here, but this requires oxygen. So we need oxygen for electron transport chain to happen. Okay. And oxygen debt is what happens when we exercise or we do something and we can't deliver enough oxygen to the muscles. And when that happens, we go into a pathway called the lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation is when we can't do electron transport chain because there's no oxygen available. And instead, we just do glycolysis and we take those pyruvic acids and convert them to lactic acid. So we just do glycolysis over and over. And that gives us a little bit of ATP, not enough to sustain us for long, but then the lactic acid will build up and it goes to the liver, and the liver turns the lactic acid back into glucose. Okay, but it needs oxygen to do that. So once we catch our breath, so let's say we have to sprint, run away from something, we make a lot of lactic acid, we can convert that lactic acid back to glucose in the liver. Oxygen debt is how much oxygen we're going to need to do that. Muscle fatigue usually happens, or muscle fatigue is when we can't contract. So we're not able to contract our muscles or contract them. Look, that pen works fine now. We can't contract them very effectively. All right, commonly caused from low blood flow. Ion imbalances. And accumulation of lactic acid. Okay. Muscle fatigue can lead to cramps, and cramps are also caused by all of those. And a cramp is a sustained involuntary contraction. All right, naming of muscles. How do we name muscles? Well, we name them by where they are. So the intercostalis muscles are muscles that are between the ribs. What they attach to, sternocleidomastoid muscles. This is why we do the bones first. This muscle attaches to the sternum, clavicle, and mastoid process. What they do, pronator teres, causes pronation. Shape, deltoid. This would be like your shoulder muscle, shaped like a triangle, which is delta. Size, gluteus maximus, so the large butt muscle. And the number of heads, biceps brachii. So biceps brachii is bi, two, seps, heads, two heads. All right, muscle responses. We have a threshold stimulus. The threshold stimulus is the minimum amount, minimum signal to cause a contraction. So it's the minimum signal to cause a contraction. Okay. A twitch is just a single contraction, single muscle fiber contracting. Okay, so we're going to start here at this dotted line. And this is y-axis is force of contraction, x-axis is time. So this dotted line is when the contraction, when the signal, the action potential, nerve signal actually arrives at the muscle. But notice it takes a little bit of time before you even get the contraction started. It's not even going to start, and that's called the latent period. And that latent period is where you're having the neurotransmitters flowing into the synaptic cleft, the sodium rushing in. It's got to travel down the muscle and down the T-tubules. Calcium has to be released. Calcium has to attach to troponin. So that's the latent period. That's how long it takes for that to happen. So once you stimulate the muscle, it takes a little bit for it to actually contract. And then the contraction happens, and your peak contraction, muscle fiber contraction, when it reaches here, the stimulus isn't even happening anymore because you've already contracted the muscle. So you're no longer stimulating it at this point, but it has happened. The refractory period, which we're not seeing on this, but the refractory period is the period after the contraction when you cannot contract the muscle anymore. So this would be like the refractory period. Okay, so you need to reset the muscle. The calcium has to flow back in. All that stuff has to happen before you can contract the muscle again. And the all or none response just means that when a muscle fiber contracts, the entire muscle fiber contracts, or none of it contracts. You don't get a partial contraction for a muscle fiber. Summation is how we maintain sustained contractions. Okay, so we add these ones together. So you get a twitch, you get a twitch here, a twitch there, a twitch there. But if you make these close enough, you can add these together to get a sustained contraction, which is what we see here. So you can just twitch a muscle, twitch it, but you're not going to get an actual sustained contraction until they're close enough together and you have enough of them. That's what summation means. Recruitment of motor units. Motor units are always recruited as we need them. So the recruitment is an increase in the number of motor units activated. So increased number of motor units. A whole muscle, one muscle, say your biceps brachii in your arm, has many, many, many motor units. So as we increase the intensity of the stimulation, so as the brain calls for more of a contraction, we'll increase more motor units until all of them are activated. So as you increase the stimulation, you increase the number of motor units until you've done all of them. Smaller motor units are recruited first. Okay. Larger ones are later. And that helps us to make smooth contractions. We should probably add in here a muscle tone is a state of a continuous state of partial contraction. So a continuous state of partial contraction. Types of contractions. It's actually, types of contractions. We have isotonic contractions and isometric contractions. Isotonic contractions are when muscles contract and they change length. Okay, so muscles contract and they change their length. The two types of isotonic are concentric, which is a shortening contraction. So say during flexion, elbow flexion, or flexion at the elbow, and eccentric, which is a lengthening contraction. So these ones change length. So here's an example of an isotonic concentric one, and then this one is an isotonic eccentric one. Okay, and then isometric is when a muscle contracts, but there's no change in length. So isometric, the muscle doesn't change in length; it just produces a force. And isometric, we do this all the time, just standing. Or if you push against a wall, your muscles aren't actually shortening or lengthening, but you're producing force. Okay, skeletal muscle actions. The origin is the part of where the muscles attach that's least movable. So it's a muscle attachment that's least movable. So, for example, with the biceps brachii muscle, we've got some origins here for the two heads, and these ones don't move a lot, but notice here, this, where it attaches to the radius, it does move a lot. Okay, so this this end that is more movable is called the insertion. So this is the end that's more movable. Prime mover is the muscle that's primarily responsible for the movement. So this is the one doing the movement, doing most of the work of the movement. Synergists are simply assisting the prime mover. And the antagonist is the muscle that does the opposite movement of the muscle. For example, the biceps brachii does flexion at the elbow, and the triceps brachii does extension at the elbow. So the triceps is the antagonist of the biceps in that particular movement. All right, stop here and we'll start another part.